Alrighty, welcome again, my friends, to All Prophecy Fulfilled, where we are attempting to define the last days biblically. That is, we have been going through the entirety of the Old Testament, looking at the prophets, and really looking at two key Hebrew words, akarith and kates. And from those two words, you probably know by now, we see such phrases as last, latter, latter in, latter days, last days, latter times, end, the end, time of the end of days, and so on and so forth. For me, it started when I went and I printed out all the occurrences of these two words, and I have them on a piece of paper, and I kind of systematically have been going through those. For kates, there's 67 occurrences. For akarith, there are 61 occurrences in the Old Testament. So that has been our MO, our method of operation. And as we've been doing this, I have been careful, or at least trying to distinguish between what I like to call an eschatological end and a non-eschatological end. So, for example, Job chapter 42:12. Now the Lord bless the latter days, there's akarith, of Job more than his beginning. How about this? And it shall come to pass at the end, or after 40 years or 70 years. So, in the Bible, in the Old Testament, these two words are used non-eschatologically, if you will. So obviously, like with Job, that is talking about the latter days of his individual life. Job had an end, kates, and that end came in his latter years, akarith. So the point is, obviously, not all ends and ladders are eschatological and relevant to this last day series. But again, I've been kind of systematically going through the prophets, looking at all the relevant or eschatological latter and end. So you might recall that I started way back in Genesis chapter 49 that I said was the first eschatological occurrence of akarith or latter. That was way back in lesson 3. Okay. And I demonstrated how the last days, according to Genesis 49:1, were specific to the last days of the children of Jacob, right? AKA Israel, the 12 sons of Jacob, the 12 tribes. And how this latter days here, that was detailing the end of something. But it wasn't the end of, planet Earth, and it wasn't something in our future. It was simply the end of what really would eventually be Old Covenant Israel, and the end of the Mosaic law that they were under. So that, my friends, is what the latter days was referring to in Genesis chapter 49. So then after that, after Genesis 49, I did this exact same thing going forward with all those relevant eschatological, ends and ladders. And you want to know the funny thing? You want to know what's funny? We never saw one end, contextually speaking, planet Earth. We never saw one single latter days of the physical universe, but we did see plenty of ends that came upon various nations through judgment, and that would include Israel. So, for example, just so you kind of, let me stir up your memory here. For example, we looked at Ezekiel chapter 7, right? And we saw Ezekiel, he was warning those living where? In the land of Israel. What did he say to them? He said, an end. The end has come upon the four corners of the land. Now the end has come upon you. So you got 3 kates right there. Those are ends. So Ezekiel here was referring to the very near judgment that came upon them via the Babylonian army. And that's exactly what happened. The lights went out on Jerusalem. The end of their world, as they knew it back then, it came to an end. So in a sense, I think we could say, this instance of Kate's really was an eschatological end. So does that make sense? I hope so. And there's just tons more examples, and that's what we've been doing thus far in this series. So, but you want to know what's really even more compelling to me? I'll tell you. in the entire Old Testament, as we've gone through it, we didn't find one single end or one single ladder that we could place beyond the first century, beyond the first generation that we see in our New Testaments. I mean, we couldn't contextually connect one single end, one single ladder beyond anything further than the final end that would eventually come upon Israel. I mean, that's fascinating to me. Man, I think that in and of itself is, I don't know, that seems almost insurmountable for the futurist if you're trying to demonstrate an end in our future, because you ain't going to find it back in the prophets. I mean, if we can't find an end that extends beyond that first generation in the Old Testament, well, what makes us think we're going to find one in the New Testament? Well, I digress a little bit, because that's actually a point that I'm going to talk about next lesson. So, what I'm saying is this: as we've moved along here, it has become abundantly clear, I believe, that the end of Israel, Israel's last days, that seems to be the main focus of the story. It's always in view. So much so that I would say that the story itself, the redemptive narrative, the Bible, it's really all about Israel's end, their latter days. So, point in case, way back around Deuteronomy 28 through 32, they're about to enter the promised land, right? And he basically laid out Israel's future from there, under the curse of the law. And then he kind of looked up further down the road, and he prophesied about the very last generation of Israel. And what did he say about them? Well, he said in Deuteronomy 32:5, they have corrupted themselves. They are not his children because of their blemish, a perverse and crooked generation. Okay, well then we go through the entirety of the Old Testament, never seeing any generation thereafter referenced to or described as perverse and crooked. And then we arrive at the New Testament, and Paul and Jesus himself, how do they describe their very own generation? Well, that's right, perverse and crooked. Well, what did Moses say that God would do or respond to this particular perverse and crooked generation? Well, he said many things. I'm just going to cherry pick a few. He said, I'll hide my face from them. I will see what their end will be. That's Kate's. For they are a perverse generation, children whom is no faith. I will heap disasters on them, for they are a nation void of counsel, nor is there any understanding in them. Oh, that they, that generation, were wise, that perverse, crooked generation, they would understand their latter end. So do you see that? Do you see what's going on there? Moses said Israel, God's people, had a predetermined end. Moses basically laid out Israel's history and ultimately their end, which would come in their latter days. But again, we've been over this, so shut up and move on, Ryan. Okay, so all this to say, I was wrong. I was wrong. The first eschatological occurrence of Acharyth is not Genesis chapter 49. You know what it is? It's Genesis chapter 4. I stand corrected, and being the honest and thorough teacher that I am, I thought I would be remiss if I didn't just take a time out, back up, and explain this a little bit. So I said we're going to get into the New Testament. Well, you know what? We are on the cusp of the New Testament. I'm kind of taking a time out, doing a little sidestep, and we're gonna look at this today because I think it is fascinating. Okay, so some time ago, it was after lesson number 3 when I covered Genesis 49. I was talking to a fella named Travis Finley. Now, some of you might know Travis. He's out there on Facebook land and YouTube land. He has a podcast, Rethinking Revelation, and we were talking about this. And we were kind of talking about, how I was doing this, going through all the occurrences of Kate's and Acharyth, and how I began in Genesis chapter 49. And Travis said, well, what about Genesis 4:3? And I said, huh? And he said, Genesis 4:3, you dumbass. No, he didn't say that. He said, Genesis 4:3. And I said, okay. So I opened up my Bible and I said, okay, and in the process of time, it shall come to pass that Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Lord. And he said, okay, so where's the Kate's there? And I said, okay, well, that's, process of time. I had it circled. And he said, okay, well, how do you think that might or ought to be translated? And it's funny, he asked me that because I actually had a little note in my Bible, and it says literally, at the end of days. Okay, well, we talked about this, and he kind of ran me through his thoughts on this. And since then, it's been a while. I mean, it's been like a good year and a half or something. I believe that Travis is correct. And my views really on Genesis as a whole have really changed on this. Genesis chapter 4 is eschatological. That is, that's the actual intent of Genesis chapter 4. That's the intent. It's an eschatological intent. When we peel back the layers, Israel's last days are in view here, and I overlooked it. So thank you, Travis, for pointing that out to me and kind of setting me on this little rabbit trail. It's been on my mind for a while, and I haven't really looked at it. So before I actually turn to Genesis chapter 4, I'm going to kind of prime the pump here a little, and I'm going to lay out just a wild assertion, and I'm going to just lay it out there for you and kind of let it sink in before we move on. Are you ready? Okay, here it goes. I better take a sip of coffee first. Okay, here it goes. Ready? The entire Bible, all of Scripture, the entire Bible is eschatological. Yep, all of it. All of Scripture, from the beginning, Genesis chapter 1 onward, is really about the end. From the beginning, it's all about the end. And look, I understand your initial hesitation or your pushback from that, or your backlash. But the more I understand and consider, ancient Near East, thought and literature, and admittedly, I'm still relatively ignorant on it, but I'm getting better at it, and I'm studying. The more and more both the eschatological and the metaphoric nature of Scripture, all Scripture, seems to reveal itself to me. So the truth is, and I'm going to demonstrate this here in Genesis 4, ultimately everything in the Hebrew Scriptures is pointing directly towards Israel's end, all of it. That's always the point. Even within all these, seemingly little or even irrelevant, what we might call sub-stories within the bigger story, the bigger redemptive story, no matter what genre you think it might be, or it might be, it's all leading to and pointing to one thing, the end of Israel. And for our purposes today, I'm saying that is exactly the case in Genesis chapter 4, where we see the very first occurrence of Kate's. That's right. The very first is in Genesis chapter 4, not Genesis 49. So in Genesis chapter 4, we see what most consider a very simple, straightforward text, a face value, plain literal story of Cain and Abel, two real humanoids that existed about 6,000 years ago, right? Well, you know what? I'm not so certain about that. Here's what I suggest. I think the true intent and the true meaning of this passage is actually to convey a typological or metaphorical picture of the last days. This text is metaphor for Israel's last days. The text is eschatological. In fact, from the beginning, Genesis chapter 1, the creation account, complete with its cast of characters, if you will, Adam, Eve, Cain, Abel, the serpent, and all those events depicted through their lives, is really allegory for something future to it, I suppose. It's a setup. That's what it is. Genesis is a setup. It's a typological picture of Israel's history and Israel's last days. Even the beginning is about the end. I know I keep saying that, but Genesis chapter 4 is really about the end of days. Genesis chapter 4, verse 3, in my opinion, should be rendered, and it came to pass at the end of days. There's your case. Why? Because the interaction between Cain and Abel is painting a last days pictures of first century events. Let me show you what I mean. Genesis chapter 4, verse 2. Well, let's read 1 and 2. Now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, and said, I have acquired a man from the Lord. Then she bore again, this time his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. So here we have Cain and Abel. Abel was a shepherd. Cain tilled the ground. So let's start with Cain. He tilled the ground that had been cursed upon Adam's transgression. Go back to 3:17, right? Cursed is the ground for your sake, Adam. Cain was working. Cain was toiling under the curse. He was tilling the ground which was cursed. Cain is working hard here, right? He's working by the sweat of his brow, folks. This is symbolic. Cain's toiling is analogous to, or allegory for, Israel's labor under the law. You know how I know that? Well, I know that Israel toiled under the curse as well, the curse of the law. You heard me correctly. According to Genesis chapter 3, the law was the curse. So when I say curse, stop thinking the curse has really anything to do with physicality, because it doesn't. Galatians 3:10, for as many as are of the works of the law are under the curse. For it is written, cursed is everyone who does not continue in all things which are written in the book of the law, to do them. 3:13, Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us. The curse was never about physicality. It was never about the human body, about the physical world, plants, animals, that kind of thing. No, the curse of the law, Paul said. So go back to Adam in the garden. He, like Israel, entered into a relationship with Yahweh, and he was placed under law. You shall not eat of the tree of knowledge and good and evil. There's your boundary. There's your command. You shall not eat of. And just like we saw with Israel in Deuteronomy 32, as soon as there's disobedience, bam! The curses of the covenant come raining down. So too with Adam. So let's back up just a chapter to chapter 3. When God told Adam in Genesis 3:17, because you have heeded the voice of your wife and have eaten the tree of which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat of it, cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. You wanted it, Adam. You got it, buddy. You chose the tree of knowledge. You chose law. And I'm going to explain to you here the connection between law and knowledge. Well, that tree right there, that's what you're going to eat. You and your descendants after you. Life under law, and you're going to keep eating it till it's coming out of your ears. So eat up, Adam. Both thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you. So there's your curses. There's the production. Nothing good is being productive. Why? It's thorns. It's thistles. And you shall eat of the herb of the field. In the sweat of your face, there's your toiling, you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for dust you are, and dust you shall return. You know what this is? I'm telling you, this is a picture of Israel under law. They toiled under law all their days until their last days. When Messiah came and said, hey, I'm going to take this stinking law away, this ministry of death, so you can stop your labor, because it's not accomplishing anything. Or you're not accomplishing anything for yourselves, salvation, redemption, etc. Now check this out. I just noticed this last night. Genesis 5, 28, 29. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he became the father of a son and called his name Noah, saying, out of the ground which the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring relief from our work and from the toil of our hands. Do you know what Noah means? It means rest. Noah was a type of Christ, and he is metaphor, or he represents the one who would bring relief and rest for Israel from their laboring under law. First century Jews toiling under the curse of the law entered the ark of Christ, just like there was an ark of Noah, and they found rest. And look, this really is the background, and this is the context that we need to keep in mind when we're in the New Testament. So when we read things like this, Matthew 11, 28 through 30, come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle, lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Man, we can rightly understand, I think, the significance and meaning of Jesus' words to his audience then, in contrast to the heavy burden of the law that they were under. Jesus, I think, was inviting those to set down their burdens and through faith take up the lighter load of Messiah over Moses, because Moses was a burden. It burdened them with a sin consciousness and condemned them. They needed to be redeemed from the curse of the law. Go look at Galatians 4. He was taking the burden of their sins of that law away for good. So again, when Adam chose the tree of knowledge and good and evil, he chose knowledge over life, and really this is the same thing I think as saying he chose law over life. Let me explain that a little bit. Adam's choice in the garden was a prophetic allusion to the last days when Messiah came and really presented essentially the same choice. Okay? Choose Moses and remain in or under law, or choose Messiah and life. You see that? Again, I think this is what my good old buddy Travis Finley pointed out. Actually, he proposed this, and I don't think I had really seen this before. But he proposed that the day, in the phrase, in the day you eat of it, Genesis chapter 2:17, that really is an allusion to Israel's last day, to the final eschatological day, prophetically speaking, or prophetically meaning, in the day you choose law over life, works over faith, flesh over spirit, Moses over Messiah, you will surely die, Israel. I think that's a fascinating idea. The people of Israel, you have those of the house of Israel, those of the house of Judah, to whom the new covenant really was being offered, Jeremiah 31, and they were being called into the new covenant of Messiah, into this new covenant garden, if you will, very much like Adam was. During the first century, they were taking part, I think, in kind of like this garden scene reenactment, and they were given the choice to choose, life or choose law. Life of Christ, law of Moses. What's your choice? And this is exactly what we see going on in the New Testament, folks. So in the garden, Adam chose law over life. Now, I want you to think about it. The tree of knowledge. What does law bring, according to Paul? The law brings knowledge of sin. Romans 7:7. What then shall we say? That the law is sin? By no means. Yet if it had not been for the law, I would not have known sin, for I would not have known what it is to covet if the law had not said, you shall not covet. When Adam ate of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, through the transgression, he understood. His eyes were open to his sin. And that was brought on, and that was made aware by the law. That's what the law did. Romans 3:20, by the deeds of the law, there shall no flesh be justified in his sight. For by the law is knowledge of sin, awareness of sin. Again, that's what the law does. Here's what happened. Adam was blind to his condition. He was naked and unaware, like an innocent child. But when God gave the commandment, I think what it did is it set in motion in Adam a boundary-driven consciousness going forward. And that really ignited, I think, into a sin consciousness after he crossed the boundary set by law. So what did he immediately do after sinning against the command? Well, he covered it up. He tried to. You know, they say ignorance is bliss, right? Well, I think for a while it was without law for Adam, but God then gave the command. Law entered, boom, sin. Transgression, sins imputed, eyes opened, shame, guilt, cover up. Sin was now imputed where it had not been before. There was a time when Adam lived without his sins being imputed to him. You know why sin was never imputed to him? It was because there was no law in place. You have to have law in order to transgress the law, in order to impute sin against the law. God only charges sin to the sinner, okay, when a sin is committed under law. Romans 5, verse 13, for until the law, sin was in the world. Now listen to this, but sin is not imputed when there is no law. When this first recorded sin of Adam, nothing changed in regard to his nature. You know, nothing changed within his heart or anything like that. Nothing physically changed. No, it really was a change of status. And I think even more than that, it was a change of consciousness. Okay, I think the change was in his mind. He went from innocent without law to guilty with law. He now had a sin consciousness. It was the fact that he was placed under law that set the wheels in motion, if you will. You know, if Adam would not have been given the boundary of law, he never would have transgressed the law, right? He would have sinned, being human, being mortal, but he never would have sinned against a law. And that's the point. If there's no law, there cannot be transgression. Romans 4:15, because the law brings wrath, and where there is no law, there is no transgression. Adam became aware of his sin through law. Remember, Paul said this, Romans 7:7, if it had not been for the law, I would not have known sin. So before law, Adam had an already existing sin nature. People don't like to hear that, but that's the truth. Did you catch that? He was a mortal sinner by default. He was human. This was his natural condition as a human, okay? He just didn't know it yet. So he was of the dust. Mortality, yes, sinful. This is humanity. Again, 5:13. Pay attention to the first half here. For until the law, sin was in the world. But sin is not imputed where there is no law. Sin was in the world. Okay, so this character, Adam, and I believe the mass of humanity, for that matter, existed as sinners, kind of stuck, if you will, in a state of mortality, sinful, and yet innocent like a child, unaware, but their sins were not imputed. They were not charged to them. Why is that? Because there's no law to sin against. Kind of like, you know, little kids who run around buck naked and they are just oblivious to their nakedness, right? They don't know any better. We have to remind ourselves, I think, that Genesis is not about God creating the very first human being and making him sinless and perfect and pure and clean, you know, only to have him mess things up, you know, through sin. No. The story portrays Adam in his natural state of the dust. You know, an existing sinful mortal man coming into covenant with God and under law, because law was a necessary means to getting, I think, Adam, and I think humanity, from childhood into adulthood. There's a progression here. I believe there's a progression really of humanity if you want to step back and look at the 30,000 foot view. In my opinion, childhood is tantamount to childhood. Think about this. To boundary driven, religious, law guiding thinking, right? Complete with reminders that come through physical sacrifices and religious rituals and all that. That's the law right there. But adulthood, on the other hand, as we progress through adulthood, that recognizes the necessity and even, I think, the innate goodness of law in and of itself, but then it's able to put law away and leave it behind you because you know that law has served its purpose. The truth is, God intentionally, through law, I think kind of stirred up, exacerbated, if you will, stimulated Adam's pre-existing condition. Okay, at first blush, I think this almost seems like nefarious of God to do such a thing, but it was actually necessary if man, or Adam, humanity maybe, was to grow up. This idea of law kind of exacerbating Adam's pre-existing sinful condition, it reminds me, in fact, I'd say it's analogous to when God gave Israel the law of Moses. Okay? In fact, Paul says that the law was added. Why was it added? Romans 5:20. Listen to this. The law was given so that the trespass, what trespass? Well, the trespass that began back in Adam, the trespass would increase. Huh? That's interesting. You mean to tell me that the law, it didn't keep Israel in line? You know, it didn't keep them on the straight and narrow. No, just the opposite, and God knew it. Israel's ongoing trespass that began in Adam increased, and that was the point. More laws meant more laws to break, more sins, more trespassing, more filling up, if you will. The law sped things up. The trespass or the transgression that began in Adam increased with the addition of the law. And I think this is something most just don't get or think about or understand. I don't know. The law was actually designed by God to impute sins. That was the point. He wanted to impute sins. Law was the necessary means to an end. Had not Adam been given the command, he would never have been made aware of his mortal condition. And listen to this. The process through which immortality could be achieved, like their road to redemption, okay, that process, it would never have been realized or even offered. How was immortality in the redemptive narrative, how was that eventually made available or achieved? Well, through Christ. And Christ came through what? The law. You see that? What we call the fall, I don't think it was a fall at all. What we call the fall wasn't a fall at all. I sound like Dr. Seuss. What we call the fall wasn't a fall at all, says Paul. Sorry. Adam and his progeny, I think they had to grow up into the realization that the law was not an end all. It was a means to an end. Okay? Some understood this and I think clung to Christ in the last days. Others did not. Either way, the law was simply a tutor until it was not needed. Galatians 3:24-25, therefore the law was our tutor, guardian, schoolmaster. To what? To bring us to Christ that we might be justified by faith. But after faith has come, after we grow up into Christ, we are no longer under a tutor, not needed. Romans 10:4, Christ is the end of the law in order to bring righteousness to everyone who believes. Christ was the end of the law. Let's press on. Okay. Kind of went down an Adamic rabbit trail, didn't I? Okay, here we go. We're gonna bust through Genesis 4 here. Oh man, it's good stuff. Still in Genesis chapter 4, verse 2. Let me read it again. Then she bore again, this time, his brother Abel. Abel was a keeper of the sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. Abel was a shepherd. all of Israel's prophets were supposed to be shepherds to and for the sheep of Israel. This is a theme throughout the scriptures, my friend. The continuous failure of Israel's shepherds to adequately lead God's people. I mean, that's thematic. That's everywhere. So while both were under the same covenant and law obligations of their father, Abel was a righteous shepherd and a prophet, while Cain, he actually murdered his brother Abel. So the evil brother shed the blood of his righteous brother, the prophet. Can you see anything in the New Testament that parallels this situation? I bet you can. Hold on to your hat, because I'll show you that here in a couple of verses. 4 verses 3 and 4. And in the process of time, or at the end of days, it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Lord, and Abel also brought to the firstborn of his flock and of their fat. And the Lord respected Abel and his offering. So Cain brought an offering that was not accepted. Likewise, in the last days, or at the end of days, those who rejected Messiah clung to Moses, and they were not accepted. Do you see the parallel? Cain's offering with those offering in the first century under the Mosaic Law. The fruit produced by the works of the Mosaic Law, it was never really adequate to produce anything. No redemption, no deliverance. Abel's offering, on the other hand, just as those entering into the covenant Messiah, offered up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God. So again, in the New Testament, you've got two different groups of people offering sacrifices. Those under Moses, those were not accepted. Those who entering into Christ, those were accepted. 1 Peter 2:5. You also, living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. And what were these sacrifices, anywho? Well, Hebrews 13:15, through him let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God. That is the fruit of our lips that give thanks to his name. That kind of goes back, I think that's a citation or allusion to Hosea 14:2. Bring your confessions and return to the Lord. Say to him, take away all our iniquity and receive us graciously, that we may present the fruit of our lips. Wow. See, I think the writer of Hebrews is just drawing from Hosea 14:2, because Hosea 14:2 is pointing them to the first century, when it would be possible to actually offer up an acceptable sacrifice. The fruit of your lips, Hosea said, repeated by Hebrews. How about Romans 12:1? Therefore I urge you, brothers, on account of God's mercy, to offer up your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. So Cain and Abel's contrasting sacrifices here in Genesis 4 were emblematic of the two contrasting sacrifices being made in Israel's last days by both those in Messiah and those in Moses. How about 5 and 8? Verse 5, but he did not respect Cain and his offering, and Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. It says in verse 8, now Cain talked with Abel, his brother, and it came to pass that when they were in the field, that Cain rose up against Abel's brother, and he killed him. Cain was angry, and he persecuted his brother. There is a rather obvious, I think, allusion to Israel's last days here. Apostate Jews persecuted first century church. The first century church. Contextually, this is just everywhere in the New Testament. I mean, this is the New Testament storyline. The persecution of the church. By who? Well, by those who were remaining in Moses, those of the law. Paul imploring the Galatians to stop clinging to the law, stop, desiring to be under law, in bondage of the law, to stop working under law. And he's doing this because the law, those of the law, they were persecuting those in Christ. Paul said, Galatians 4:28-29, now we, brethren, as Isaac was, are children of promise. But as he who was born according to the flesh then persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, even so now it is, he says, in his day. Same thing going on here. And then Peter mentions this persecution to the diaspora a number of times, really. And in fact, I think he told them they really shouldn't be surprised by what was going on in their time. 1 Peter 4:12, beloved, do not think it is strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened to you. Peter could have said something like this. He could have said, hey guys, this ain't no surprise, okay? Remember Cain? Remember him? Well, of course you do. Just like Cain persecuted and killed his brother, well, so too with us today. That's what's going on, said Marvin Gaye. This is just history repeating itself, or maybe it's just history prophetically predicting itself, I guess. I don't know. Their story, Cain and Abel, really is our story. He could have said that. Would have been a little more clear, maybe. He was saying, look, we're coming out of the bondage of law and we're offering up acceptable sacrifices to God. Our brothers who choose to remain loyal to law and put their confidence in their religiosity, really, are naturally doing what their father Cain did. The persecution of Abel is a signpost pointing to the last days. By the way, did you notice I just said Cain was their father and he was of the wicked one? More on that in a bit. 4:7, if you do well, will you not be accepted? Speaking to Cain. And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door and its desire is for you, but you should rule over it. Cain had a choice, folks. Do well, as Abel had done, and be accepted by God, or be ruled by sin. Sin under law. First century Jews had a choice. Do well by entering into the liberty of Messiah and be accepted by God, or you can continue in bondage under the law and you can be ruled by the law. You can be judged by the law. You can be ruled by your imputed sins under that law. That law that they took their confidence in. 4:10 says, what have we done? And he said, what have you done? This is God speaking. The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. So Cain persecuted his brother, and he was responsible for Abel's blood, which cried out from the ground. What is this a picture of? Does Matthew 23 ring a bell? I hope it does. Matthew 23, man, this is such an important passage, I think, where Jesus, he is just lambasting the religious leaders of his day, okay? But for what? Well, for their role, really, in being unfaithful shepherds, just like Cain, I said, was an unfaithful shepherd. And not only that, but they were also, just like their fathers had done, they were persecuting and killing the prophets. So then, just like the blood of Abel cried out, so too the blood of all the prophets cried out from the ground for justice, and their bloods was on the heads of that final generation of Jews. So when exactly did this ongoing persecution and murder of the prophets begin? Where did it all start? Yeah, you know where I'm going with this. Genesis chapter 4 with Abel. It's right here. This is where the persecution of the prophets begins. Watch the connection. Matthew 23:29. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, and say, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have partaken in the blood of the prophets. What days are in view here? So Jesus is looking back to the days of their fathers. Israel's fathers. And just like the scribes and Pharisees did in Jesus' day, likewise, their fathers persecuted and killed the prophets in their day. Matthew 23:32. Fill up then the measure of your father's guilt. Who was guilty? Israel's fathers, who murdered the prophets along with the religious leaders whom Jesus was addressing. They were all filling up, and they were continuing in the footsteps of their father's guilt. Okay? Let's keep going. 35. That on you, Jesus said, may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple of the altar. Listen, who did the killing of Israel's prophets begin with, according to Jesus? Abel. What does this make Abel? Israel's first prophet. Who murdered Abel? Cain. Who killed Israel's prophets, beginning with Abel, according to Jesus? The fathers of Israel. What does this make Cain? A father of Israel. So then, if Abel was the first murdered prophet of Israel, and Cain was a father of Israel, and Adam was their daddy, then what does that make Adam? Adam is Israel's first father. Isaiah 43:27, your father sinned and your mediators have transgressed against me, I think seems reasonable to suggest is referring to Adam, Israel's first father. Okay, 11 through 14. You know what? I'm not going to read that. I'm just going to comment on it. It's kind of lengthy. You know, there's so many different allusions or so many different phrases and things I could go to there. But just let me say this, you know, Cain, in 11 through 14, Cain was cursed for persecuting or killing his brother. And he was driven out. It says, surely you have driven me out this day from the face of the ground. That's verse 14. It says here in 11, so now you are cursed from the earth, and so on and so forth. So Cain, he was cursed for this persecution and killing. Again, toiling under the curse of the law, just like Israel, being cut off or driven out from the land. That was the price to be paid for this continuing transgression. And man, there is a lot of reference to being cut off in Exodus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. So later on in the New Testament, you have apostate Jews under the curse, and they were cursed for rejecting Messiah and persecuting and killing their brothers, just like Cain was. And they too were ultimately cut off from the land in judgment. This was this was a major preaching point of Jesus. This was the content of a lot of his, sermons, if you will. Judgment was coming. Get out of Moses, get into Christ. Well, there's so much more, but you know what? I've gone on and on about this. I'm going to stop right about now. So I'm going to wrap this up. See, I think I've demonstrated my point, probably ad nauseum, probably too much. I think my opinion on this, from what I see, the metaphoric nature, the prophetic nature of Genesis, I think it's a reasonable thing to consider. At the very least, I think a more accurate translation of Genesis 4:3 should be at the end of days. And I think that should at least make us raise our eyebrow a little bit and consider the possibility that this just might have some layers of intended meaning. I don't think it happened by accident. This kind of lying beneath the surface of a seemingly, plain literal surface. So, and I think it does. The truth is, I think, this is just me, I think Genesis 4:3, the very first occurrence of Cain in the Bible, I think it's pointing dead center, directly ahead at the last days of Israel. The very first occurrence of Cain is Genesis 4:3, and yes, it's eschatological. It is painting a metaphorical picture of the last days through the storyline of Cain and Abel. So anyway, special thanks to Travis Finley for challenging me to think on this one and try to come to my own conclusions. And I believe you are right, my friend. I believe Genesis 4:3 is indeed eschatological. In fact, I'm going to stick with my wild claim. I believe the entirety of Scripture, this entire thing from beginning to end, really is eschatological. Okay, thank you for sticking with me on this. If you did, I know it's kind of a lot to chew on, a lot to listen to. Appreciate it if you did. Next time, we will dive into the New Testament. I promise you that. Until then, we will see you next round. Adios.